They say a desperate woman is the most dangerous creature in the American Southwest. Martha Calloway intended to prove it. The map burned beautifully. She watched the parchment curl at the edges, the ink dissolving into orange flame, and felt something unlock in her chest she hadn't felt in years: power. Cold, clean, absolute. Silas Black crossed the camp in 3 furious strides and seized her wrist hard enough to bruise bone. "What have you done?" Martha looked up at him, this cold-blooded man who had made every woman in his orbit feel small, and smiled for the first time in weeks. "I've made myself necessary." That smile had cost her something. She knew it even as the words left her mouth. Men like Silas Black did not tolerate being outmaneuvered, and they certainly did not tolerate being outmaneuvered by a woman who looked like Martha Calloway. She had seen that particular look before, the slow tightening around the jaw, the eyes going flat and reptilian, the way a man recalculates his options when the one he assumed was weakest suddenly refuses to behave like prey. She had seen it on the wagon master's face, too, just before he dropped her canteen in the dirt and told 43 silent witnesses that she was no longer their problem. She had been walking for perhaps 2 hours when the Black Wolf gang found her. She did not think of it as bad luck. Bad luck was spilling coffee on a clean dress. What happened to Martha Calloway in the red New Mexico desert on a Tuesday afternoon in late August was something of a different category entirely, the kind of thing a woman files away in the deep wordless part of herself where all the unsurvivable things go, the things she survived anyway. The riders came from the east, 6 of them kicking up a rooster tail of pale dust that turned copper in the afternoon light. She had stopped walking when she heard the hoofbeats. There was nowhere to run. The desert here was flat and merciless in every direction, a bleached pan of cracked earth and scrub brush stretching to a horizon that shimmered like hot glass. So she stood. She planted her feet in the dirt, and she stood. And she thought with a clarity that surprised even herself that if this was the end, she would at least meet it on her feet. It was not the end. It was in many ways something considerably worse. Silas Black was not what she had expected. She had heard the name spoken in frightened whispers at every way station and trading post between Santa Fe and the Arizona Territory, a name attached to stories that grew more lurid. With each retelling, a man who burned things, who took things, who left nothing behind him but scorched earth and grief. She had expected someone monstrous in the way that fear makes men monstrous. In the imagination, enormous scarred eyes like 2 holes burned through a blanket. What she found instead was a lean, almost elegant man in his early 40s with a silver-streaked beard kept carefully trimmed and pale gray eyes that reminded her unpleasantly of a winter sky just before a killing frost. He wore his violence quietly, the way some men wear expensive clothes as though it was simply part of his presentation, something he had long ago stopped thinking about. He looked her over with those winter eyes and said, without particular cruelty, "You'll do." She was not sure what she would do for exactly, and the first several days did not clarify matters so much as expand them into new and more humiliating directions. She cooked. She hauled water from a spring a quarter-mile from camp in clay vessels that left her shoulders aching so badly by evening that she could barely lift her arms to stir the pot. She mended tack and washed clothes and was spoken to only when someone wanted something, and even then was spoken to the way a man speaks to a piece of furniture he finds mildly inconvenient. The other men in the camp were not individually remarkable. They were simply the same type she had seen her whole life. Men who had decided at some early point that the world owed them more than it had delivered, and who had resolved the discrepancy through violence rather than labor. They ignored her when they could and looked through her when they couldn't, and she understood, with a bone-deep weariness that had nothing to do with the water hauling, that this too was simply a variation on a theme she had been living inside for nearly 60 years. Invisible, useful when needed, otherwise furniture. She might have endured it indefinitely. She was not by nature a woman who required the world to notice her. She had learned that lesson young learned it, the way you learn the temperature of a stove once, quickly and with lasting effect. But on the 5th night, sitting close enough to the fire that she could feel the heat on her face, and far enough from the men that they had forgotten she existed, she heard it. They were not being careless. She understood that later. They simply did not consider her a relevant audience. She was the camp woman, the mule, the piece of furniture that happened to have ears, and it apparently did not occur to Silas Black or to any of the 7 men drinking whiskey around that fire that furniture sometimes listens. The silver mine was called the Esperanza. She knew the name. Everyone in the territory knew the name. It sat 3 miles outside a town called Harlow's Creek, and it employed most of the town's able-bodied men and fed most of the town's families, and had been pulling ore out of the red rock for 11 years without serious incident. What Silas Black was planning would end all of that in approximately 4 minutes. The Gatling guns were for the mine entrance. The dynamite was for the shaft itself, and the 2 main streets of the town timed to go in sequence, so that anyone who ran from one would run directly into the other. She sat very still beside the fire and listened to him lay it out with the same quiet, precise manner he brought to everything, and she thought about the families in Harlow's Creek, the women and the children and the old men who were too worn down to work the shaft anymore, but who still sat on their porches in the evening and watched the sun go down over the red hills. And she felt something move in her chest that was not fear. It was older than fear. It was the thing underneath fear, the thing that fear is supposed to protect the part of a person that refuses on some fundamental and inarguable level to simply let wrong things happen. She went looking for the map 2 days later when Silas rode out with 3 of his men to check on a supply transfer and left only a skeleton crew in camp. She had spent those 2 days mapping the habits of the remaining men as carefully as she now mapped the landmarks on the parchment she found rolled inside a tin canister behind the false bottom of Silas's strongbox. She had perhaps 12 minutes. She used 9 of them standing over the fire with the map unrolled across her knees, reading it the way she had once read her mother's Bible, slowly with her whole attention fixing each landmark in the geography of her memory, with the patient, methodical precision of a woman who had spent 58 years being told she was not particularly clever and had spent 58 years proving otherwise in silence. The canyon with the split-faced rock. The dry creek bed that ran southeast for exactly 3 miles before turning sharply north. The pair of juniper trees that had grown together at the trunk. The red formation that looked from a certain angle like a crouching man. The cache itself set 40 feet back from the formation inside a shallow cave marked with 3 cuts in the sandstone horizontal, deliberate, made by a man who wanted to find it again and did not want anyone else to find it first. She closed her eyes. She held it all in the dark behind her eyelids and tested it, moving through it landmark by landmark, the way you move through a house you have lived in long enough to navigate without light. It held. Every turn, every distance, every cut in the stone. She opened her eyes and dropped the map into the fire. It burned beautifully. She was still watching it when she heard the horses coming back early, and she arranged her face into the expression she had been perfecting since childhood. Placid, unreadable. The face of a woman who has been standing by a fire, doing nothing of interest whatsoever. Silas came through the camp entrance and looked at her with those winter sky eyes, and she looked back at him with nothing on her face, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Then he crossed the camp in 3 furious strides and seized her wrist hard enough to bruise bone, and the burned corner of the tin canister caught his eye, and he understood, and his face went through several things in rapid succession, none of them pleasant. "What have you done?" She had thought about what she would say. She had spent 2 days thinking about it, which was, she felt, appropriate preparation for the most important sentence of her life. She had turned it over and examined it from every angle, the way you examine a weapon, before you stake your life on it, checking the balance, checking the edge, making sure it would do exactly what you needed it to do when the moment came. She looked up at him, and she smiled. "I've made myself necessary." Silas Black was not a man who made the same mistake twice. She understood that about him within the first hour after he understood what she had done, and she filed it away alongside everything else she had learned about him in 5 days of being invisible in his camp. He did not rage. He did not strike her. He walked away from the fire and stood at the edge of camp with his back to her for a long time, and when he turned around, his face was composed again, those winter eyes giving away nothing, and he looked at her with something that might in a different man have been respect, but in Silas Black looked more like a recalibration. "You'll tell me where it is," he said. It was not a question. "I'll take you there," she said. "That's the arrangement." The arrangement, as she laid it out with her hands folded in front of her and her voice as steady as she could keep it, was simple. She was the map now. She was the only map. She would navigate them to the cache when Silas was ready to move, and in exchange, she would be kept alive and unharmed and fed something that qualified as actual food. And when the job was done, she would be released with a horse and 3 days of provisions and enough distance between herself and the Black Wolf gang to make pursuit not worth the trouble. Silas listened to all of it without expression. Then he was quiet for a long moment, and she held herself very still inside that silence, because she understood that the next 30 seconds would determine whether she lived through the night. "You memorized it," he said finally. There was something in his voice she could not quite name, not admiration. Closer to the way a man sounds when a card game goes in a direction he did not anticipate. "Every landmark," she said, "every distance, every cut in the stone." Another silence. The fire crackled between them, and somewhere out in the dark a coyote called and was not answered. "All right," Silas Black said. She slept that night for the first time since her capture with something that was not quite peace, but was at least the absence of that particular bottom-of-the-well dread that had been her constant companion since the riders found her in the desert. She had bought herself time. Time was not safety, and it was not freedom, but it was the raw material from which both things could eventually be constructed, and Martha Calloway had been building things out of insufficient materials her entire life. They gave her 3 more days. She used them the way she used everything carefully, without waste. She watched, and she listened, and she catalogued, and what she catalogued most carefully was the composition and the habits of the detachment Silas was assembling to escort her through the Slot Canyon to verify the landmarks. 7 men, all of them armed, all of them the type who had been doing this long enough that the alertness had gone out of their eyes and been replaced by a kind of habitual contempt, the dangerous overconfidence of men who had never yet been seriously surprised. She noted the gaps in their attention. She noted the narrow place in the canyon route where the walls came close enough together that a man on horseback would have to slow to a walk. She noted these things and said nothing, and cooked their food and hauled their water, and waited. The morning they moved out was cool and very clear, the kind of desert morning that felt almost like a promise before the sun got high enough to start breaking it. She rode in the middle of the column on a dun mare that was too tired to be difficult, her wrists unbound because Silas had made the calculation correctly that a woman who had gone to the trouble of memorizing a weapons cache rather than simply running was not going to do anything impulsive before she saw an advantage worth taking. She kept her eyes forward and her face neutral, and she recited the landmarks silently to herself. Not because she had any intention of delivering them to this detachment, but because the discipline of it kept her mind from going to the places it wanted to go, the dark circular places where fear lived. She heard the first shot before she understood what it was. It came from above and to the left from the high rim of the canyon wall, where the sandstone broke into a series of jagged shelves, and a man who knew what he was doing could lie flat and see everything below without being seen himself. The shot took the lead rider out of his saddle with the efficiency that suggested the shooter was not particularly interested in drama. The second shot followed so quickly after the first that the horses were still shying from the sound of the first when the second man went down, and by the time the detachment had registered that they were under attack from above, a third shot had made the number of men capable of responding to the attack considerably smaller. What happened next was not chaos exactly. It was more like the rapid, violent reorganization of a situation that had, until 30 seconds ago, appeared completely stable. The remaining men scattered toward the canyon walls, which was the instinct but not the strategy, because the canyon walls were exactly where the shooter wanted them, pressed against stone, unable to maneuver, unable to get angles. Martha pulled the dun mare hard to the right and kept her head down and focused on not being trampled, which was a more immediate concern than it might sound, given the number of horses suddenly moving in confined space with no particular coordination. She did not see the man come down from the rim. She heard him, or rather she heard what she initially thought was a second shooter, but quickly understood was a horse, a single horse, moving through the confusion with a purpose and a sureness that was entirely unlike the panicked animals around her, picking its way through the disorder as though it had been briefed on the situation in advance and found it entirely manageable. The horse was dark, almost black, with a broad chest and an intelligent eye that assessed the scene with what she could only describe as professional calm. The man on its back was somewhere north of 50, silver-haired, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been weathered by decades of outdoor living into something that was past handsome, but had arrived at something more durable. He moved through the remaining men with an economy that she found, even in the middle of everything, genuinely impressive, not theatrical. Not aggressive beyond what the situation required, simply effective in the way that a man is effective when he has been doing a thing for long enough that it no longer costs him any excess motion. When it was over very quickly. The canyon was quiet except for the horses and the wind moving through the high, narrow slot of sky above them. The man looked down at her from the saddle. He had very dark eyes for a silver-haired man. The horse, she noticed, had not moved an unnecessary inch throughout the entire engagement. "You hurt," he said. "No," she said. He nodded once as though this confirmed something. He was already looking at the canyon entrance, scanning the rim-running calculations she was not privy to. She recognized the behavior. It was the behavior of a man who operated in dangerous places and had learned that the moment after a threat was resolved was frequently the moment before the next one began. "These men work for someone," he said. It was not a question either. "Silas Black," she said, "and there are more of them, considerably more." He looked at her then, really looked at her the way people rarely did, not through her or past her or at the general category of her, but at her specifically with his full attention. She was 58 years old and broad and dusty, and she had been a camp mule for 5 days, and she was fairly certain she did not look like anyone's idea of a critical intelligence asset. She held his gaze anyway. "Silas Black," he repeated, and something moved across his face, brief and dark like a shadow crossing open ground. "You know the name," she said. "He took my traps. 3 seasons' worth. I've been tracking his supply lines for 2 months." He said it without particular emotion, the way a man states a navigational fact. Then, after a pause, "Why were they escorting you?" She considered how much to tell him and concluded that the situation did not leave a great deal of room for strategic withholding, "Because I'm the only person alive who knows where his weapons cache is. Gatling guns and dynamite, enough to level a mining town called Harlow's Creek." She watched his face. "I burned the map. I memorized it first." The silence that followed was the particular kind of silence that a person produces when they are rapidly reassessing everything they thought they understood about a situation. He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back at him, and behind them, the canyon wind moved through the narrow passage with a sound like distant breathing. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever heard," he said, "or the most foolish." "Possibly both," she said. "I find they're not mutually exclusive." Something shifted in his expression, then very briefly, almost too quickly to catch, like a door opened and closed in the same motion. He swung down from the saddle and picked up a revolver from the dirt near the closest fallen man and held it out to her without ceremony. "Grip first." She took it. It was heavier than she expected, or perhaps she was more tired than she had realized. She checked the cylinder the way her father had taught her when she was 12 years old on a farm in Kansas before the farm, and the father and the Kansas were all gone, and found it satisfactory. "My name is Elias," he said. "Martha Calloway," she said. He nodded. He was looking at the canyon entrance again. "Silas will know within the hour that this escort didn't make it through. He'll send the main force. I know," she said, "which is why we need to move." She held the revolver at her side and looked at him steadily. "Get me to Harlow's Creek to warn those people, and I'll give you everything they stole from you, the gold and the guns both. I know exactly where it all is." She paused. "I am, as I said, a very reliable map." Elias looked at her. The dark horse looked at her. The canyon wind moved between them. "We can't outrun the main force," he said. "Not with the horses we have and the ground we'd have to cover." "Then we don't outrun them," she said. "What do we do instead?" He was quiet for a moment. He was looking west, out past the canyon mouth toward the open desert, where the sky was beginning to do something on the horizon that Martha had not yet looked at closely enough to interpret. When he spoke, his voice had the particular flatness of a man delivering information he would prefer not to be delivering. "We find cover," he said, "and we wait them out." He paused. "There's an old adobe way station about 4 miles west. Been abandoned for years. It's not much." Martha looked west. The horizon was changing color in a way that had nothing to do with the time of day. It was going dark at the bottom, and darker above, that a wall of shadow that stretched from the ground to what seemed like a considerable distance up into the sky, and it was moving toward them. 4 miles, she said. "We'd need to ride fast," he said. She looked at the tired, dun mare. She looked at the dark horse who was watching the horizon with an alertness that suggested he understood the situation better than most of the humans present. She looked at Elias, who was already checking his rifle with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything. "Then let's ride fast," she said. They made it to the adobe with perhaps 12 minutes to spare, which Martha calculated was exactly 12 minutes more than she had expected. The hubbub announced itself before it arrived, the way catastrophic things sometimes do, with a silence that was too complete a stillness in the air that pressed against the eardrums like held breath. The birds were gone. The insects were gone. Even the wind that had been moving through the canyon grass since morning had stopped, and in that absence, the wall of red dust on the western horizon looked less like weather and more like a judgment, a solid thing 300 feet high and moving with the slow, inevitable purpose of something that had been building itself for a very long time before anyone bothered to notice. Elias got the horses into the lean-to at the side of the adobe, while Martha pushed through the warped wooden door and took stock of what she had to work with. The answer was not encouraging, and she chose not to be discouraged by it. The single room was perhaps 20 feet by 15, the walls thick adobe that had been cooking in the New Mexico sun for what looked like several decades, the floor packed dirt, the 2 windows shuttered with wooden panels that hung at angles, suggesting the hinges had given up their ambitions some years back. There was a fireplace on the north wall, a rusted iron pot, 3 wooden crates that had survived whatever abandonment had emptied this place, and a quantity of red dust on every surface, suggesting the haboob outside had been sending advance scouts for some time. She had the windows braced and the door barricaded with the heaviest crate before Elias came back inside, and she was already at the fireplace checking the flue when he stopped in the doorway and looked at what she had done. He didn't say anything. She didn't require him to. The storm hit 20 minutes later. It did not arrive gradually. It arrived the way Silas Black crossed a room with total commitment and no preliminary negotiation. The sound was the first thing, a low roar that climbed rapidly into something that was less like wind and more like the sustained note of an enormous instrument played by something that had no interest in music. And then the light went, the clear desert afternoon simply ceasing to exist outside the shuttered windows, replaced by a darkness that was the particular dark red of the inside of a closed fist. The adobe shuddered, the door strained against the crate. Fine red dust came through every crack and joint in the walls and hung in the firelight like smoke. Martha had gotten the fire lit. It was small and it was smoky, and it was in the context of the shrieking dark outside enormously important. She had found in the crates a quantity of dried beans, 2 tins of salt pork that she judged were on the survivable end of a canvas water bag that was perhaps a quarter full, and 3 wool blankets that smelled like they had been used by something 4-legged and were nonetheless blankets. She set the beans to soak in the iron pot and portioned the water with the precision of a woman who had spent 5 days in an outlaw camp learning exactly how little a person needed to function and exactly how much the knowledge of scarcity could concentrate the mind. Elias sat with his back against the south wall and cleaned his rifle with the systematic attention of a man who cleans his rifle the way other men breathe, not because he is thinking about it, but because not doing it is not something he knows how to do. He had unsaddled Diablo before the storm hit and settled him in the lean-to with a calm competence that she had noticed the way the horse responded to him, not with the nervous obedience of a broken animal, but with what she could only call trust. The ease of a creature that had been given consistent reasons to believe that the person it was with knew what they were doing. "How long?" she asked. "Haboob this size this time of year?" He considered. "Could be 3 hours. Could be until morning." She looked at the door. The crate was holding. The barricade she had built against the lower window frame was holding. "And Silas? He'll know where we are," Elias said. "This is the only cover for miles in any direction. But he can't move in this any more than we can. His men horses." He paused. "We have until it breaks. Till it moves." She accepted this with a nod and went back to the fire. There was a rhythm establishing itself between them that she found despite everything unexpectedly comfortable. He did not talk unnecessarily. Neither did she. He did not offer help she hadn't asked for. She did not perform the kind of cheerful competence that women of her experience sometimes performed for men, the "look how capable I am" demonstration that was really just a preemptive defense against being dismissed. She simply did what needed doing, and he simply did what needed doing, and the small space organized itself around 2 people who had both apparently spent enough time alone in difficult circumstances to know how to share a room without requiring anything from each other beyond basic decency. The beans took an hour. She flavored them with the salt pork and a small quantity of dried chili she found wrapped in paper at the bottom of the 3rd crate, and served them in the tin cups that were hanging from a nail beside the fireplace, and Elias ate with the gratitude of a man who had been living on trail food for 2 months and knew better than to pretend otherwise. "This is the best thing I've eaten since February," he said. "It's beans," she said. "It's very good beans." She looked at him across the fire. He was looking down at the cup with an expression she recognized because she had worn it herself on occasions too numerous to count the expression of a person surprised by an unexpected small mercy in the middle of an otherwise unmerciful situation. She looked away before he could catch her looking. Outside, the storm was doing something with the wind that produced at intervals a sound like a human voice, a low, sustained note that rose and fell and rose again without resolving into anything, just that raw and wordless cry moving through the dark outside the shuttered windows. Martha had heard haboobs before. She knew the sound was simply air forced through particular configurations of rock and gap and broken wall. She knew this, and it was still an unsettling sound, and she was in the process of deciding to say something practical and weather-related when she heard Elias stop breathing. It was not a dramatic cessation. It was the very small, very total stillness of a person who has been ambushed by something from the inside. And she turned to look at him and found him sitting exactly as he had been sitting back against the south wall, but with his hands flat on his knees and his eyes fixed on the middle distance, and his face doing something complicated and private that she had not been meant to see. She said nothing. She watched the fire. She waited. The wind made the sound again, that long, low, wordless note, and she heard him exhale very slowly, the kind of exhale that is not relaxation, but the deliberate manual override of a body that has started doing something the mind is trying to stop. "Elias," she said, quietly, the way you speak to something that startles easily. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was level in the way that things are level when considerable effort has been applied to making them level. "I know this place," he said. She waited. "I built it," he said, "or most of it. The south wall is mine, the fireplace." A pause. "We used to stop here when we were running a trapline north of the Sangre de Cristos, my wife and I." Another pause longer. "Her name was Catherine." The fire crackled. Outside, the storm pressed against the walls with a patience that had nothing human in it. "How long ago?" Martha asked. 11 years. He was quiet for a moment. "Outlaws. We'd stopped here for the night, and they came through looking for provisions, and I was." He stopped. The muscle in his jaw moved. "I was at the spring, quarter-mile from the door. I heard it, and I ran back, and by the time He stopped again. This time the stopping had a different quality. The quality of a man arriving at the edge of something he has approached many times and has never yet found a way across. "By the time I got back, it was over." Martha sat with this. She did not say she was sorry because she was sorry, and the word was not large enough to be worth saying. She did not say she understood because she did not, and claiming otherwise would have been an insult to what he was carrying. She sat with the fire between them, and let the silence be what it was, which was not empty, but full of 11 years of a thing he had apparently been carrying alone in the desert. And she thought about the weight of that, the specific and exhausting weight of grief that has no place to be set down. "I should have been there," he said. It came out differently from the rest of it, rougher, without the careful levelness he had been maintaining. "I have thought about that every day for 11 years, every single day. I should have been there, and I wasn't, and there is not one version of that story that I have ever been able to tell myself where that changes." The wind made it sound. The fire moved. Martha set down her tin cup. "Can I tell you something?" she said. He looked at her. His eyes in the firelight were very dark and very tired in the way that has nothing to do with sleep. "My whole life," she said slowly, choosing each word the way you choose, footing on uncertain ground. "I have been the kind of woman that people look past, not through exactly, past, like I'm something in the middle distance that the eye adjusts around on its way to something more interesting." She paused. "My mother told me when I was 7 years old that I would need to make myself useful because I was not going to make myself pretty, and she was not a cruel woman, she was just a practical one. And she was right in the way that practical people are often right, which is in a way that costs you something every single day." She was looking at the fire. She could feel him listening. "I have been useful," she said. "I have been useful my whole life. I cooked and I worked and I helped and I gave my last canteen of water to an old man who needed it more than I did. And do you know what that bought me?" She paused. "A wagon master pointing at me in front of 43 people and telling them I was too fat and too old to be worth the trouble of keeping alive." Her voice was steady. She was somewhat surprised to find it steady. And the 43 people said nothing. Not one of them said a word. They just watched me walk away into the desert. The fire crackled between them. The storm pushed against the walls. "That is not a new story for me," she said. "That is the story I have been living inside for 58 years. That I am tolerated when I am useful and invisible when I am not. And that no one has ever once in my entire life looked at me and seen something worth." She stopped. The word she wanted was too large and too fragile to say in the middle of a haboob in an abandoned adobe with Silas Black's men somewhere in the dark outside, so she left it unspoken and let the silence complete the sentence. Elias was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she had begun to construct the graceful exit from the conversation, the practical pivot back to water rationing and storm duration, and the tactical situation awaiting them on the other side of the weather. Then he moved, not quickly, with the deliberateness of a man who has made a decision and is committed to it. He crossed the small space between them and sat beside her close enough that she could feel the warmth of him alongside the warmth of the fire. And he did not say anything. He simply reached out and covered her hand with his very gently, the way you cover something that has been left out in the cold for too long, and sat there. She did not move. She did not speak. She was 58 years old, and she had been invisible for most of those years, and she sat in the firelight in the middle of a howling red storm with this silver-haired man's hand over hers, and felt something in her chest perform a slow, complicated movement that she did not have a name for, because she had never before had occasion to need one. After a while, he put his arm around her still, without speaking, and she leaned into him because she was very tired, and because the wall was warm, and because something about the quality of his silence told her that this was not a man who would require her to explain or minimize or apologize for needing just once for a little while to let someone else hold some of the weight. Outside, the haboob screamed. Inside, the fire held. Two people who had each spent decades learning to survive alone sat together in the dark and discovered with the careful wonder of those who have been a long time without water, finding an unexpected spring that surviving together was a thing they had apparently both, without knowing it, been waiting a very long time to try. She heard them before she saw them. The storm was still at its peak when the voices came, carried through the walls in fragments. Words torn apart by the wind and reassembled into something that was not quite language, but was unmistakably human and unmistakably hostile. Martha was already awake. She had not slept, not truly, though she had drifted in and out of something adjacent to sleep in the warmth beside Elias, and she had been aware even in that half-consciousness of the quality of the storm changing the way the pitch of the wind shifted in the last hour from a sustained roar into something more irregular, more directional, the sound of a thing that was beginning to exhaust itself. Elias was at the window before she had fully registered that she was standing. He moved without light, without noise, with the absolute sureness of a man navigating by a map that existed only in his nervous system. She watched him press his back against the wall beside the shutter and tilt his head, listening, and she crossed to the other window and did the same. And through the gap in the warped wood, she could see nothing but red dark and moving dust, but she could hear beneath the wind the sound of horses being held by men who were not certain what was in front of them. "Martha." Elias's voice was barely above a whisper. "Count." She listened. She counted the distinct sounds of horses, the particular way hooves shift on packed earth when an animal is standing, and uncertain the individual cadences of different animals in different states of agitation. 6 horses, she said. At least, could be 8. 8, he said. I make 8. Silas's voice came through the wall then, and it had the quality of a voice that is projecting itself against weather with total confidence in its own authority, not shouting exactly, but pitched to carry. Elias! A pause. The wind took the next words and scattered them. Then more clearly, I know you're in there. Send out the woman, and we'll call it settled. Elias said nothing. He was looking at the door, not at her, but she understood from the angle of his attention that he was calculating something, and she waited. She's worth nothing to you, Silas continued. The wind dropped for a moment, and his voice came in very clear and very level, the voice of a man making a reasonable business proposition. She's a camp cook from a wagon train that didn't want her. She has nothing. She is nothing. Give her to me, and you walk away clean. The fire had burned down to coals. In the red-orange light they cast, she could see Elias's face in profile, and what she saw there was not anger. It was something quieter and more complete than anger, the expression of a man who has arrived at a clarity so total that there is nothing left to deliberate. She crossed to him. She kept her voice very low. How many can you take from outside? In this visibility with Diablo, he considered, all of them if I can get to the perimeter and work from the outside in. They're grouped at the front. They haven't flanked yet. He paused. But I need to go out there. She looked at the door. She looked at the window. She thought about what it would mean to open either one and release into this room what was waiting in the dark outside, the violence and the noise and the specific kind of chaos that destroyed the fragile particular thing that existed inside these 4 walls. The warmth, the quiet, the fire, the blankets, the tin cups still sitting where they had been set down beside a conversation that had changed the shape of something fundamental inside her. No, she said, not in here. He looked at her. Not in this room, she said. It came out with more force than she intended, and she did not take it back. Whatever happens, it doesn't happen in here. He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once with the weight of a man who understands exactly what is being protected and exactly what protecting it will cost. I'll need 10 minutes, he said. Can you hold the door for 10 minutes? I can hold the door for considerably longer than 10 minutes, she said. Something moved across his face. Then, briefly, the same thing she had seen in the canyon when she checked the revolver cylinder, that quick opening and closing of something he kept very carefully interior. He reached out and touched her face just once, his thumb against her cheekbone, the gesture of a man who has decided that the situation does not permit elaboration, but that some acknowledgement must be made anyway, and then he turned to Diablo. The horse was in the lean-to, separated from the main room by a half wall and a hanging blanket, and he was standing with his ears forward and his attention on the door, with an alertness that suggested he had been tracking the situation outside with considerably more precision than any of the humans. Elias went to him and spoke to him very quietly, his mouth close to the animal's ear, and Martha could not hear the words, but she could see the horse's response. The way the tension in his body reorganized itself from vigilance into something more purposeful, the readiness of an animal that has been told what is happening and has decided it is manageable. Then Elias took his bandana and tied it carefully over Diablo's eyes. She watched him do it, watched the care he took to smooth the fabric to ensure it sat flat without pressing, to run his hand down the horse's neck after feeling the animal accept the darkness with a trust that was in the context of everything almost unbearable to witness. A blindfolded horse navigating a zero-visibility storm, guided only by a man's hands and voice and the animal's own extraordinary senses. It was not a plan. It was an understanding between 2 creatures who had been through enough together that conventional limitation had ceased to apply. Silas is going to try the door when I go out, Elias said. He was checking his rifle in the coal light with the same systematic attention as always, each motion deliberate, nothing wasted. He'll wait a few minutes to see if I've left you unguarded. When he does, he'll try the weakest point first, which is the left window. The brace you put on it is good, but the lower hinge is rotten." "I know," she said. "I reinforced it with the leather from the second saddlebag." He looked at her. "When did you do that? While you were sleeping?" He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. He picked up his rifle. He looked at her in the cold dark with those very tired, very dark eyes, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything that was adequate to the moment, because nothing adequate existed, so they said nothing, and it was, she found, sufficient. He went out through the door fast and low, and she had the crate back against it before the wind had finished its assault on the open space. She heard Diablo's hooves on the packed earth outside, muffled almost immediately by the wall of dust and wind, and then there was nothing from outside but the storm and Silas's voice, which had gone quiet in the way that dangerous men go quiet when the situation has changed in a direction they did not anticipate. She positioned herself between the door and the left window with the revolver in her right hand and a length of iron she had pulled from the fireplace frame in her left, and she waited. She was very good at waiting. She had spent 58 years becoming excellent at it. The first attempt on the left window came 7 minutes in a sustained pressure, followed by a sharp impact that cracked the lower brace but did not break it. She crossed to it in 3 steps and put her back against the shutter and her boots against the floor, and held it through 2 more impacts that traveled up through the wood and into her spine like hammer blows. And she thought about Harlow's Creek, and the families in it, and the old men on their porches, watching the evening sun go down over the red hills, and she held. Silas's voice came from directly outside the window, close enough that she could hear the individual words without the wind tearing them. "You are a very stubborn woman, Martha Calloway." "Yes," she said through the wood and the wind, "I am." A pause. "It won't matter." "Most things don't," she said. "I find that doesn't stop them from being worth doing." He didn't respond to that. She heard him move away from the window, and she stood in the cold dark and listened to the storm and counted. She had reached 437 when she heard the first shot from the perimeter, distant and directional from the north side, and then a second from the west, and then a silence that stretched long enough to become significant, and then nothing. Nothing but the wind. The wind, and gradually, incrementally, the beginning of a change in the wind, the slight slackening that precedes the slow unraveling of a haboob that has spent its force and is beginning the long process of returning to the stillness it temporarily displaced. She felt it through the walls before she heard it in the air. The adobe exhaling the pressure against the shutters, easing by degrees so gradual they were almost imperceptible. She did not move from her position between the door and the window. She stood and she waited, and she breathed, and she counted, and at some point she became aware that the red dark outside the shutter gaps was changing color, lightening from the absolute dark red of the storm's interior to something closer to the amber of late afternoon, and she understood that the sun was still out there, that it had been there the entire time, that the world had not actually ended while she was holding the window shut, which was, she decided, a useful thing to have confirmed. She heard Diablo first. The specific quality of those hoofbeats, unhurried, completely certain, moving toward the door with the same directional purpose she had observed in the canyon. She listened to them cross the distance from the perimeter, and she did not let herself interpret them too early, did not allow herself the relief she wanted until she heard beneath the diminishing wind the sound of the rifle being set down in the dirt. A deliberate sound. A sound that was the opposite of threat. She moved the crate and opened the door. The dust was still settling, drifting down in slow red curtains through the amber light, and Diablo came through it first with his blindfold gone and his head up, and his dark eyes finding her immediately with an intelligence that she had decided over the past several hours was not merely animal. Behind him, Elias walked out of the settling dust with his rifle on the ground behind him and his hands at his sides, and his face tired in the specific way that a man's face is tired when something that has needed doing for a long time has finally been done. He stopped in the doorway. He was not unscathed. There was a cut above his left eye that had bled down his temple and dried there, and his jacket had been torn at the shoulder, and he was carrying himself with the slight careful carriage of a man managing pain he has decided is not worth mentioning. She looked at him in the amber light, this battered silver-haired man standing in the doorway of the home he had built and lost and come back to without intending to, and she felt something in her chest perform again, that large, nameless movement that she had first felt when he put his hand over hers in the dark. She stepped back from the door to let him in. He crossed the threshold, and she closed the door behind him on the settling dust and the amber light and the desert silence that was filling the space the storm had left. And the room was warm from the dying coals and the walls that had spent 30 years absorbing the New Mexico sun, and she reached up and pressed the clean edge of the blanket carefully against the cut above his eye. He let her. He stood very still and let her and Diablo pushed his nose against the half-wall of the lean-to, and exhaled with the profound satisfaction of an animal that has had an interesting afternoon and is now prepared to accept some rest, and the coals in the fireplace ticked quietly in the silence. 8, she said. 8, he said. Silas. A pause. Silas is the kind of man who doesn't send others to do what he won't do himself, he said. He was there. She pressed the blanket gently against his temple and looked at him, and he looked back at her. And outside, the last of the dust was falling through the amber light like something that had been held up for a long time and had finally quietly been allowed to come to rest. They left the adobe at first light. The desert after a haboob had a quality that Martha had never found words for and did not try to find words for. Now a scrubbed raw clarity, as though the storm had taken everything that was not essential and carried it off somewhere else, leaving only the bones of the landscape red and gold and utterly still beneath a sky that had returned to its improbable blue. The air tasted clean in a way that air rarely tasted in the territory, and the silence was the particular silence of a world that has been shouted at for many hours and is now very quietly recovering its composure. Elias had dressed his own cut before she woke, or had tried to, and she had redressed it properly without commenting on his attempt, and he had accepted this without comment, and they had eaten the last of the beans cold from the tin cups and divided the remaining water with the precision that had by now become habit between them. They rode with Diablo, carrying them both, because the dun mare had not survived the night in the lean-to, which was a loss Martha noted, and set aside, because there was nothing to be done about it, and a great deal still to be done about everything else. She rode behind him with her arms around his waist and the revolver on her hip, and the entire geography of the weapons cache arranged in perfect order in her memory, and they rode west toward Harlow's Creek through the scrubbed and silent morning, and did not talk very much because they had said in the dark of the adobe the things that most needed saying, and what remained between them now was something that did not require words to maintain its integrity. The town appeared in the middle distance after 3 hours, a cluster of low buildings against the red hills, the mine's head frame visible above the rooftops, the faint sound of activity carrying across the flat ground in the clear air. Martha felt Elias's breathing change slightly as they approached the careful, deliberate deepening of a man who is preparing himself for a different kind of engagement. And she tightened her arms around him briefly once and felt him acknowledge it with a slight straightening of his spine. The sheriff was a compact, serious man named Aldridge, who listened to everything Martha told him with his hands flat on his desk and his eyes on her face, and the focused, unhurried attention of someone who understood that the woman in front of him was not confused or hysterical, but was instead delivering intelligence that required immediate action. He asked 3 clarifying questions. She answered all 3 with the precision that came from having held the map in her memory for 6 days through captivity and a haboob and a siege, and had not lost a single landmark. He sent riders to the cache within the hour and sent a wire to the territorial marshal's office, and then he stood up and shook her hand, which was not a thing that men in positions of authority in the New Mexico Territory did habitually with women who looked like Martha Calloway, and she accepted it without making anything of it, because the gesture itself was sufficient. The riders came back by afternoon. They had found the cache exactly where she said it would be, 40 feet back from the Crouching Man formation, marked with 3 horizontal cuts in the sandstone. 12 crates of Gatling gun components, 40 cases of dynamite, Elias's 3 seasons of stolen traps bundled and stacked in the back of the cave with the practical organization of men who intended to sell them and had not yet found the right buyer. The town of Harlow's Creek absorbed the news of its near destruction with the specific combination of relief and fury that communities produce when they understand how close they have come to ceasing to exist. There were men who wanted to make speeches. There were women who brought food to the sheriff's office and pressed Martha's hands and looked at her with the wide, clear-eyed gratitude of people who were calculating behind their eyes the specific shape of the thing they had not lost. She accepted all of it with the same composure she brought to everything graciously without diminishment. Without the apologetic deflection she had spent decades practicing, because Elias was standing beside her, and something about his presence made the apologetic deflection feel not only unnecessary, but actively absurd. It was the following morning that the wagon train came through. She heard it. Before she saw it, the familiar creak and roll of heavy wagons on packed earth. The particular complaint of wooden wheels that needed greasing sounds she had lived alongside for 3 months and had not expected to hear again. She was standing in the town square with Elias waiting for Sheriff Aldridge to finalize the paperwork on the reward when the train rolled in from the eastern road and began its slow, familiar process of arranging itself along the main street for resupply. She recognized the wagon master immediately. He was a large man named Greer, red-faced and self-important in the way of men who have been given a small authority and have spent years expanding it in their own estimation. He was stepping down from the lead wagon when he saw her, and she watched the recognition move across his face, followed by the rapid series of recalculations that followed it, and then with a predictability that she found more exhausting than surprising, the recalculations resolved themselves into the same conclusion they always resolved into with men like Greer. He pointed at her. It was almost the same gesture as before in the desert in front of 43 witnesses. Almost, but not quite, because this time there was uncertainty at the edges of it, because she was standing differently than she had been standing when he last saw her, and she was standing next to a man and a horse that both had the quality of things that had been through considerable difficulty, and had come through it intact, and were not particularly interested in being trifled with. "You, Greer said. "I thought the desert had you." He looked her over with the assessing eye of a man doing an inventory. "Get yourself attached to a mountain man. Did you smart enough for that at least?" He turned to address the gathering crowd with the ease of someone who had always found crowds responsive to him. "This woman," he announced, with the volume of a man making a public service announcement, "abandoned my wagon train, left her post. If she's told you any different, she's a liar on top of everything else." The square had gone quiet. Martha was aware of it going quiet, aware of the particular quality of that silence, the held-breath attention of a crowd that senses it is about to witness something worth witnessing. She was also aware of Elias standing beside her and of the precise moment when he moved. He did not reach for his gun. She had known he would not, and the knowing of it was something she could not entirely account for, except that she had spent enough time reading him by now to understand that the gun was not his first language, only his last. He stepped forward, and it was the step of a man who occupies exactly the space he occupies without apology or inflation, And he stood between Martha and Greer, and he looked at the wagon master with those dark, tired, completely steady eyes, and the square was very quiet. "This woman," Elias said, and his voice was not loud. It was simply completely audible in the silence that had organized itself around him, rode into an outlaw camp. She burned a weapons map rather than let it be used to destroy your town. He paused. Your town specifically. The Esperanza mine, Harlow's Creek, the people in it. Another pause. She memorized every landmark of that cache and held it in her memory through 6 days of captivity and a haboob and a siege, and delivered it to Sheriff Aldridge with a precision that allowed his men to find the guns and the dynamite before a single person in this town was harmed. The square was silent in the way that squares are silent when a crowd is doing rapid collective arithmetic. She gave her last canteen of water to an old man who needed it, Elias continued, and you left her to die in the desert for it. He let that sit for a moment just long enough. I want you to understand something very clearly. This is Martha Calloway. She is the bravest person I have ever known. She is the reason everyone in this town is alive today. And she is mine, and I am hers. And if you point at her again, I will consider it a very serious error in judgment. He said it quietly. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, without performance, without excess, with only the weight of a man who has arrived at a truth, and is stating it because it is true, and for no other reason. And it was Martha thought standing in the morning sun, in the square of a town that was alive because of her, the most complete sentence she had ever heard spoken in her direction in 58 years of living. Greer looked at Elias. He looked at Diablo, who was regarding him with an expression of profound and patient contempt. He looked at the crowd, which had rearranged itself in the way that crowds rearrange when they understand which direction the moral weight is falling. He looked at Martha. She looked back at him. She did not say anything. She had said in the dark of the adobe the things that needed saying, and she had let Elias say the thing that needed saying in the sun of the square, and what remained now was simply the fact of her standing here, broad and dusty and 58 years old and completely entirely present. Which was, she had concluded, the most radical thing she had ever done. Greer got back on his wagon. The crowd did not cheer or jeer. They simply turned away from him with the collective unhurried indifference of people who have assessed a situation and found one party of it not worth their further attention, which was Martha thought considerably more devastating than either alternative. Sheriff Aldridge brought the reward money that afternoon. It was more than she had expected, and she said so, and he told her that the territorial government had added to it on account of the weapons cache being a matter of significant public safety, and she accepted this without argument. Because arguing with money that was honestly earned had never been a habit she could justify. She and Elias sat on the steps of the sheriff's office in the late afternoon sun and divided it on the practical grounds that they had both earned it her with the map and the siege, and the beans him with the canyon and the perimeter and 3 seasons of stolen traps recovered, and when the dividing was done, she looked at the amount in her hands, and then looked at him. "I want to go back," she said. He looked at her. "To the adobe," she said. "I want to fix the south wall, the left window hinge, the lean-to roof." She paused. "It's a good location. Travelers coming through the territory need a way station, a real one, with water and food and a place to sleep that isn't the ground." She looked at the money in her hands. "We could do that." He was quiet for a moment. The afternoon sun was doing what afternoon sun did in New Mexico, turning everything gold, the dust and the adobe walls and the red hills in the distance and the silver in his hair, all of it going gold and warm and long-shadowed. He was looking west in the direction of the desert, in the direction of the place he had built with his own hands, and lost and come back to through a haboob and a siege and 11 years of carrying a grief that was too heavy for one person to carry alone. "The fireplace draws well," he said finally. "It always did." "I noticed," she said. "The spring is a 1/4 mile north. clean water even in August. That's important for a way station, Badsham, she said. The south wall is sound, he said. I built it to last. It held through last night, she said. That's a reasonable test. He looked at her then, and she looked at him, and the gold light was on both of them, and Diablo stood at the hitching post behind them, with his ears forward, listening to the conversation with the alert attention of an animal who has learned over many years in difficult country to pay close attention to the decisions of the humans he has chosen to travel with. "All right," Elias said. They went back in the morning. It took 3 weeks to make the adobe into something that deserved to be called a home, rather than simply a structure that kept the weather out. And Martha found, to her own considerable surprise, that she had opinions about what a home should feel like that she had been accumulating for 58 years without ever expecting to deploy them. She had opinions about where the light should come from in the morning, and how a kitchen should be organized for a person who cooked seriously, and what a window needed in terms of sill width to be genuinely useful, and how a porch should be positioned relative to the prevailing afternoon wind. Elias built what she described and improved on it with the knowledge of a man who understood the specific demands of desert construction, and they argued occasionally about the practical and the aesthetic. And the arguments were the comfortable arguments of two people who respect each other's competence enough to push back against it. And they resolved them the way all such arguments are best resolved, through the patient iterative process of two people figuring out how to build something together. The sign above the door was his idea, burned into a plank of pine he had carried from town on the last supply run, 2 words in careful, plain letters: Callaway Station. She stood and looked at it for a long moment when he hung it, and he stood beside her and said nothing, because he understood with the precision that came from paying close attention to a person for several weeks of shared difficulty, that this was a moment that required nothing from him except his presence, which he was entirely prepared to provide. The first travelers came through 6 days after the sign went up, a family of 4 from Texas Dusty, and depleted the children too tired to be difficult, and the parents too tired to be proud. Martha fed them, and Elias watered their horses, and they slept on the clean blankets in the second room, and left the next morning with the particular restored quality of people who have been cared for unexpectedly in a hard place. The mother pressed Martha's hand at the door and said thank you in the way that people say thank you when they mean something considerably larger than the word itself contains. "You're welcome," Martha said. "Travel safe." She stood in the doorway and watched them go, their wagon diminishing against the red and gold landscape, and behind her the adobe was warm with the smell of bread she had set to bake before dawn, and from the porch she could hear Elias's voice, low and unhurried, talking to Diablo about something that was apparently worth discussing, the way he always did in the mornings, the way she had come to understand he always had this silver-haired man and his dark horse in conversation with the desert morning. She turned back inside. She checked the bread. She adjusted the damper on the fireplace that drew so well because he had built it to last, and she listened to his voice on the porch, and the horse's quiet response, and the silence of the desert beyond them. That vast and patient silence that was not empty but full of everything that had been here before them and would be here long after the red hills and the sky and the clean water in the spring a quarter-mile north, and the road that came from the east and went west, and carried people through, people who were tired and depleted, and in need of a place to stop, a place where someone would see them and feed them and ask nothing of them except that they travel safely when they left. She had spent 58 years being invisible. She had spent 58 years being useful in ways that no one noticed, and surviving things that no one witnessed, and carrying weights that no one acknowledged, and she had done all of it alone, which was the only way she had known how to do anything until a silver-haired man came down from a canyon rim on a dark horse and handed her a revolver and listened to her, really listened. in the way that people listen when they are not waiting for you to finish so that they can speak but are actually receiving what you are giving them. And she had looked at him across a fire in the dark of a haboob and understood with the quiet certainty of something that does not require deliberation that this was a person she had been moving toward without knowing it for a very long time. The bread was ready. She took it from the oven and set it on the sill to cool, and the smell of it moved through the open door and out onto the porch. And she heard Elias stop talking to the horse, and a moment later, his boots on the porch boards, and then he was in the doorway, filling it in the way that he filled spaces completely without effort, with the unhurried solidity of a man who has finally stopped moving and found that the place where he stopped was exactly where he was supposed to be. "Bread," he said. "Bread?" she confirmed. He came inside. He sat at the table she had insisted on positioning to catch the morning light which came through the east window at this hour in a long, warm rectangle that fell across the wood like something deliberate, like something that had been planned for, and Diablo's nose appeared at the open door for precisely the length of time it took to establish that the bread was not for horses, and then withdrew with dignity. Martha cut 2 slices and set one in front of him and sat across from him in the morning light, and they ate together in the comfortable silence of people who have run out of the need to fill silence and have discovered on the other side of that need something considerably better. Outside the desert stretched in every direction, red and gold and enormous and indifferent. In the way that places are indifferent that do not know or care what small and particular miracles are taking place inside the structures that human beings build within them. The road came from the east. It went west. People would come. They would be tired. They would be fed and rested and sent on their way, and the sign above the door would tell them where they had been, and they would carry the name with them into the territory, and beyond it, the way travelers carry the names of places that gave them shelter when they needed it. Callaway Station, in the warm gold morning with bread on the table and boots on the porch boards and a dark horse standing in the desert sun, that was exactly what it was.